Hi students, this is the video module on um, prehistoric to Egyptian. And I've started the PowerPoint off with, and as you may know, in this module there is a PowerPoint of everything I'm showing you without me talking. It's just the PowerPoint. Also on that one I have the page number references to the images in the text that you're using. So I wanted to start this off with showing you again, as you do this section, since that first paper is going to be you taking those artifacts and describing them using the art vocabulary that I've highlighted for you. I will, on some of the slides, I've indicated what they are specifically, and others I haven't, so you can practice using them. So this is, again, those in yellow are the only ones you are required to use. If you see some others, as I went through it, I saw maybe I should have highlighted shape. But if there's one here that I haven't highlighted that you want to use, please use it. You're welcome to do that. So, as we begin these chapters, what we need to do is we need to really be looking at and keeping in mind this greater picture or these greater ideas, to do some comparisons that reference distinctive things that this civilization or period in history achieve. We're going to be looking at any rituals that they do, new vocabulary, art and literature eventually, image making, politics, how they govern themselves. So what we're really doing is in this, because humanities is all those things, not just artifacts. It's everything that they do in a culture just like us. So what I wanted to do is to remind you of that. So although we talk about a lot of details, really that's the greater picture. And when I teach my students, I say, look, in the theory classes, don't think about the details first and then this bigger idea. Always work from the larger idea, the larger sort of overarching idea, and then you think of those details that support that. So for example, you would say literature. What is a literature in Egyptian civilization? Is it Book of the Dead? Okay, etc. How did they govern themselves? You would say, okay, Pharaoh, Egyptian, and then you would look at Sumerian when you have assemblies, etc. And there's always these creation theories that you really want to think about as well. And another thing is, I think for you to stay interfaced with this is for you to be thinking about yourself and our culture. And when there's a creation theory that we're going to talk about, then think about your creation theory. And that way you will be connected and not separate from the information. And I think that would help you understand the material. Prehistoric means before written history. That's what it means. And these dates, by the way, are, I say circa, they're around. I never say it is absolutely this date. So there is leeway here. As you'll see, maybe, well, she said this was earlier or that was later. It doesn't matter. Just understand this greater epoch that we're talking about. And really talking about two periods, and that is the Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, and the New Stone Age. And the Paleolithic is really where we start, when people are nomadic, migratory, they're moving around. And when you do that, like with the Native Americans, the Plains Native Americans in our country, they built movable shelter, like teepee shelters, everything they could move, on a horse or walk. So that's like the Paleolithic period. People are migratory. It's not until the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, that they're actually building structures to live in, developing tools, communicating with language, and developing these ideas about, belief system. So, you've just sort of got to separate that in the beginning, and then we can start breaking it down into specifics. And you're going to see from early on is that people, humankind, us, we created rituals, and we created myths. And both of those, creating the myth or the ritual, are not silly. Those are ways that we as people choose to make sense of this world we live in, nature. So we'll talk about that, and eventually even, afterlife theories. So, um, so the new standards, Neolithic period, like with the Sumerians, for example, is, people are living in, we'd say, villages. This is really when civilization begins, because when you're settling down and you're living in a village, you create towns, you create civilizations, you domesticate animals. You're just not in the nomadic period, roaming, hunting. You're still hunting, but now you really begin to farm. And when you have groups of people that stay in one place, then you're going to have the rise of a civilization. I'll mention it earlier, or later rather, the location or geography is also important. So when you have the rise of a civilization like the Mesopotamian civilization or the Egyptian civilization, it's because they're on rivers. And that geographic region is important to the development of that civilization because of the natural resources that are there. So now this is very interesting, because your book starts with this image, the Caves of Lascaux, which is early cave painting. I'm going to call it painting or drawing. And, it's on the side it's in a cave on the side of a wall. And that's where your book begins. But this is what I said earlier in my first video is, part of this course is really looking a little more analytically at how even material in a text in education is presented. Because education is a series of canons, and a canon is a greater belief system that a culture believes or authorities believe is true or valid or should be perpetuated. Well, the problem with that is that, as this is an example, when we start with our text, and there's all this talk about France and Europe, and beginning with these early cave paintings, well, actually, that can build bias, because the earliest cave paintings were not in Europe. They were in Africa, on the continent of Africa and Australia. So I think that's important for us to always look critically at, what we're studying, and think about some other possibilities. And, you always need to think critically about what's being presented. So this image you see, it's very interesting because, this is a drawings, but drawings didn't come first. Actually, sculpture came first, because it's easier to take a piece of clay and to carve a figure with our hands than it is to have an idea about, a concept. I'm going to draw an image of this animal, and how do I do that? So conceptually, when you have drawing, and that's why sculpture is earlier, our evolution, we keep evolving, and that is an evolutionary step, to draw a picture or paint a picture of an idea of what we want to communicate, versus something as simple as taking a ball of clay and molding it into a figure. So I want to talk about that first, and then I want to divert from this slide in the beginning of the book and talk about, actually, Africa is earlier. And I have on this slide here those early images in Africa. And when we talk about images or artifacts, that subject tells you everything about the culture. What are they drawing or painting? And in the earliest caves in Europe or Africa or Australia, they are predominantly hunting, because to survive, you need to, you need to kill animals, and you need animals for clothing, and so you're going to see animals. Now, these in Africa, you also see pictures, images of people, and they're like stick figures. So notice that stick figures are a lot more crudely drawn, or not crudely, elementary is a better word, than something a little more sophisticated as trying to draw the form of an animal with shading and light, as you see here. So this is sans art, and this is an example of some of the earliest. They call them cave paintings or drawings, but you're also going to see in the sands people that you're going to see dance, because early on with these images, you're going to see how the subject of dance is very important to this ancient culture, ancient period, and that when you have dance, you have ritual, and ritual leads to religion. Just as if you have, or if you participate in some type of organized religion, there is ritual during that process, right? Yeah. So, and so here's some beautiful examples of, here's another term, rock art, cave paintings, cave drawings. It's all the same thing. And this is in Australia. Now I'm going to go back to the san art, because this shows you the people and their dancing, and I would call these stick figures, and there's still the animal. And so already early on, in this early period of our history, our human history, you see that we want to connect to something greater than ourselves, like in the ritual, that we can somehow influence the future. And so the ritual becomes very important to our participation in thinking of, and will evolve into formal religion, that we can participate or in our future, or what's going to happen the next day in our lives. So that's an example of that. And this is, the San culture is, as you read this, I'm not going to read word by word in these slides. I expect you to go back and study these thoroughly, since you're not using a text. But this is what our gene pool, it goes back to 600,000 years ago, the San culture in Southern Africa. And so when we say that Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization, we're talking about writing, recording history, but we refer to the continent of Africa as the cradle of humankind, because all our genetics can be traced back to parts of our genetic to the San culture. They have unique markers, different than ours, but we share some of the same gene pool. So here's an example and this is, it's called Lucy. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. This to date is one of the earliest skeletons we have discovered or uncovered. I think there's another one in China. Don't hold me to it. But this is from Ethiopia, and it is thought to be one of the earliest skeletal remains that we have, originating in Africa. And here is the emergence of us as a species. And as you can see, we were sort of short by that skeleton. And that wasn't unearthed until 1974. So 600 to 200,000 BC, were evolving as Homo sapiens on this continent. And the reason that I talk about this as well is because the continent of Africa, and I have one entire PowerPoint on the continent of Africa in this module for you to look at, because they had many civilizations that are significant and contributed to humankind and influenced other civilizations. So we're going to get to that as we move towards Mesopotamia and look at some of those contributions. But now I'm going to take you back to Europe and to the beginning of the text. And you have this slide called the Caves of Lascaux. Lascaux is Lascaux, France, and it is Paleolithic period, and it is in Europe. So you've already seen images earlier, much earlier than this. This is around 15, I think this is around 15,000 BC in Europe. So this is only part of a much larger space, and this cave is deep, 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 deep inside the earth. And it wasn't discovered until the 20th century by accident because it's so deep inside the earth. And it's huge inside there. So this is only a section. And so as you can imagine, if you've ever been to a cave or sat by firelight in the dark, in the center of this cave is a fire pit where people would sit. And on these walls, these painted walls of animals, there are also chip marks where people would throw their spears against the wall and try and hit these animals. So we say then that the purpose of this is ritualistic. It is ritualistic to improve hunting. Why else would you throw? I mean, I don't think they were just playing like, a child that throws a stick. This is serious business, surviving. And here you have an artist that has drawn these images of these bison or horses. And some of these are very, very large, by the way, as large as the animal themselves. You just don't see it in this slide right here. So you can imagine the magic of being down in this cave. It's dark. There's a fire lit, and fire flickers, and that fire is bouncing off the light of those walls, and then these hunters are throwing their spears, trying to hit those animals for good hunting in this ritual. So that's actually your first slide. And in this slide, what I've done here is I've just sort of outlined when you write about these for Friday using these terms. I've highlighted those words that you would be using. Now, you don't have to write it like I've written it, but that's a way you can do it and describe it. You're not going to bullet point it or list it. So I say the style, and in yellow is our vocabulary. The style on the Cave of Lascaux is linear and representational. The two-dimensional subject of animals are drawn using, and I go on and I go on and I go on. So you need to go back and look at that as an example on the PowerPoint, without me speaking, of how you would want to do that. So I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, use a discussion board. I'll even have chat open if you want to use that. Now, this is your second piece, and it is found in Austria. This is called the Venus of Willendorf, and those titles, this artist didn't say, oh, I'm going to name this the Venus of Willendorf. No, no, no. Archaeologists who unearth these artifacts give them that name because that's where they were found. And as you know, Venus is the goddess of love. All right. And so that is during the Greco-Roman period. Actually, I think that's Roman. So this is still Paleolithic. Now, what is this? What are you looking at? What is that artifact? What does that represent? How would you describe it? Well, this is a fertility goddess. Fertility goddesses were very predominant during these periods, Paleolithic and Neolithic. And because you think about it, what do you need to survive? What is going to be the subject of these artifacts? Hunting, therefore animals, and increase the tribe, which would be reproduction. And up to this point, women are the only ones that reproduce. So what you have here is a small figure. Now, it's small and it can fit in your hand because this is the Paleolithic period, and people are migratory. So they take things with them. So the scale or the size is very small. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a form that is a pregnant woman. So you have a distended or large belly. You have large breasts. There's no detail on the hands. The feet are not lost. They're not important. This is not a portrait. You can see some kind of headdress or some kind of hair treatment, but there's no face because this is not a portrait. And so that is going to be the second important subject in Europe, is going to be this. This is what we're looking at. I brought in Africa to show you that there are other parts of the world that are also important and what was happening, like the dance and animals. But this is, we're looking at specifically animals and reproduction. So that's what that little sculpture is about. And it is, I would say it's definitely representational, you know, this full-bodied figure. So next, our text takes us to, as we leave Paleolithic period, we just have those two examples of the caves and the Venus of Willendorf, what objects or images are being produced and why, and what is the circumstance, which is migratory. Then we move to the cradle of civilization. Your text refers to this as the cradle of civilization in the Neolithic period in Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia is between the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's why it was so fertile. It's also called the Fertile Crescent. It's near Jordan, Iraq, Iran today. So it's a significant area in our political history at this time. But before we go there, I want to go back. I want to go back to Africa, the continent of Africa. Because on the right side of this table, you see the Mesopotamian timeline. We're going to start with the Sumerians, and they're around 3000 BC, 2750, 2000, 750. But when you look on this chart, the African timeline, you know, you're going to see earlier dates. You're going to see earlier dates when different groups of people are predating this idea about animal husbandry and those kind of things. So, you know, again, I don't think you should think about one place everything happened, because it didn't. It was happening in other places too. But, you know, in teaching something or in books, you know, we like to give these dates that begin and end things when, you know, to be a critical thinker, you need to understand that those are symbols for events. It is not inclusive. There are other things happening in other parts of the world. Okay, I think you get my point. Now, so really, the earliest civilizations then were in Africa. And here is a beautiful example of, now some sources say 35, some say 35,000, 20,000, 22,000. It doesn't matter to me. It's early. The Shante bone. And this bone is our oldest example artifact of people that are counting. They're counting, they're enumerating. And so that's what that looks like. And then here is another example of what some people call a tally stick. But again, this was occurring much earlier than the Sumerians. So there is proof there that I wanted to share with you. So you see, by 4500, and in Samaria we start around 3500, 3000, with it being pretty organized civilization. By 4500 BC, in Africa, you already have systems of government. And you have, when we talk about government, constitutional representation by elders, a council of elders was universal. So this is already setting up on that continent this idea, in parts of the continent, not Egypt, this idea of a council of elders. Egypt goes a different way, totally different way. Now, let's go back to Mesopotamia. Neolithic period, 7000 BC. There we are between the Tigris and Euphrates River, called the Fertile Crescent. And that area, the reason it was so fertile is because those rivers would flood, and then the silt would set, and then you had all this silt to grow crops. And of course, when you have rivers, you have fish. And so, it's a lot easier to survive than in the middle of a desert. Now, how do you become a civilization anyway? And that just simply means you have the rise of a group of people, and you have complex political, economic development. You're writing. It's historic. Prehistoric was before writing. Now you're keeping records because you're writing. And so it's pretty much, what we have today in many ways. You're cooperating with each other. Geography influences how we live. And in this case, Sumerians and the Egyptians flourished. The Egyptians were a little earlier, the Sumerians were a little earlier than the Egyptians because the Nile was so abundant with food that the Sumerians had to work a little harder. And then you have architecture, you have literature, you have stories. So you have all these things, really, that is central to our culture, how we live. Mesopotamia, when we look, this is a time period, and it includes different groups. We call them civilization. They're really sort of the same people, but they're broken off into civilizations. And so what happens here is the Sumerians are the earliest, and then they're conquered by the Akkadians. And as you look at this slide here, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians. Well, there are others like the Neo-Sumerians and the Neo-Babylonians. So what I've done here, we just want to highlight the major ones. And then the Assyrians are conquered by the Persians, and then the Persians are conquered by the Romans. Well, actually, this region is very interesting because they're very, what they do is they are always fighting, like they're for maybe 50 to 200 years, it's stable. And then one group rises up to take over the next group. And again, this is the area of Iraq, Iran, Jordan. And so there's always this fighting taking place every 50 to 200 years, let's say, and between that. But what happens is there's two things that are very interesting. Number one, they assimilate. That means they don't annihilate. The Assyrians don't annihilate the Sumerians, they just assimilate. They take part of what the Sumerians did, and you will see visually how their works are similar, but yet a little bit different. So they assimilate. They don't just level and annihilate. So you'll see all of it's actually pretty similar. And by the way, it moves from abstract representation to, with the Assyrians, pretty realistic. Excuse me, the Akkadians with Sargon. Pretty realistic representation. Well, that's very interesting because Egypt wasn't like that. Egypt remained the same stylistically for around 3,000 years. And their works, their artifacts, their pyramids, everything they create reaffirms that stability, those monumental sculptures and architecture and tombs like the pyramids. It represents the stability now of a civilization. Now, when I say it didn't change, oh yeah, certainly they had skirmishes. Yeah, they had economic problems, some parts. It's broken down into kingdoms. Yes, okay. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying, in general, as a whole, it's pretty amazing that it remained the same. The only real difference was, especially stylistically, with works being produced and a belief system, was Akhenaten, who was Nefertiti's spouse, because he believed in one God. And I don't know, there's so many Egyptian gods. They're just, I mean, my colleague knows them. I don't know all of them because I'm not interested. But there's so many. It's very complicated. Akhenaten, though, was a visionary. He's also known as the sun god, or the sun pharaoh. And he believed in monotheism. And you're going to see that's not new. Now, there's a lot of different faiths in the world, and so monotheism is part of Protestantism and Catholicism and Judaism. You know, most faiths, in Islam, it is monotheistic. But an Egyptian was monotheistic. Now, he was a visionary, and his work was very different. The artifacts, a lot more curvilinear, not as rigid. The lines, and when he passed, a lot of his work, or the artifacts, were destroyed, and they went back to being, you know, this 3,000-year-old style that they used. So we're going to look in these slides at these major civilizations. And all we're going to do, because it's a survey, we're going to just look at those things that they did differently, or what makes them unique. And I may just pull out one thing. Not other things, but just one major thing. So again, here you've got to have this bigger idea about, wait a minute, here's a region that fights all the time when you think of 3,000 years, and here is a civilization, the Egyptians, that pretty much remain the same. So that's what I mean by really thinking about a bigger picture and what that means. And then looking at the details. So when you see this image, you might think those sculptures are not attractive, and I would probably agree with you. What you're seeing at the top is a piece of sculpture. I'm sorry, a piece of architecture. It's a ziggurat. It's a piece of architecture, and it still exists. It's at in Iraq today. And it's made of sun-dried brick. It still exists, students, after thousands of years. Now, the top has been worn off just by time and wind and rain. But this architecture is very important because it houses important developments by this civilization that are very important. And so before we get to those developments, they have a creation theory. The Sumerians have a creation theory. And they say that human beings are shaped from clay by a divine craftsman, granted a heart by the goddess Namu, or were formed from the blood of two gods, sacrificed for that purpose. So what you're seeing here is, first of all, a creation theory. I'm assuming you have a creation theory. Everybody has a creation theory in general. And so this is theirs. So for these sculptures to look this way, actually it's very interesting as well, students, because the West has always been representational, and the eastern part of the world, has always leaned more towards abstraction. And I cannot answer why. And so here we're in the East, and these figures are very abstracted. The West, I'm talking about Europe, us are just obsessed with realism. But not these folks. So here you have these first sculptures that you're looking at. The only thing you've looked at so far is the Venus of Willendorf, the fertility goddess, right, from Austria in Europe. And now you're looking at the East. You're looking at Mesopotamia and the Sumerian sculptures. These sculptures would be found in a room in the ziggurat, that figure or that architecture above. And so they represent a belief system. And so it's hierarchical, which means the tallest are the most important. And these are like little figures that you would have in the ziggurat, in a meditation room, and you would bring wine or oil or food, and you would put it at their feet in this ritual. And so it's hierarchical in that the tallest is the most important. Abu, the god of vegetation, is that tall one, and then Ki, the mother goddess, is the second. And then you've got some people like us that are standing around, with the gods and in prayer pose. Now, I do not call them realistic, but I think they're abstracted. So again, I don't do this through the whole PowerPoint. Sometimes I highlight to remind you, you need to look for the words you're going to use. So in this, I would say these are abstracted figures. There's a formal stance. That's very important. This formal stance, all ancient works are formal. Egypt, this region, it's not until the Greeks that we get informal. And there's a reason for that. They have large staring eyes. Oftentimes there's stones in their eyes or shells, and they have one brow. That one brow is to bring focus towards the eyes, the window of the soul. And so the guys are wearing skirts, bare-chested, and the women are standing there with a dress on. And as you can see, there is repeating patterns in the crimped beard and as well in the dress itself. And so, that's how you would describe that. And they're made out of clay. All right. Title of that is Statues from the Abu Temple. So those would be found in the temple. Now, I'm going to go back to this architecture. If you look very closely at the image, you will see a car. It's either a Chevy or a Ford, I'm not sure. But you can see that's relatively new, that image. So let's talk about their belief system. Well, they believed in many gods, and we call that polytheistic. They believed that we were created to execute the will of the gods, to serve the gods. And a priest or a king would tell us. Now, they also believed, the Sumerians, that we were manipulated. We are manipulated by the gods. And things that happen to us are attributed to the gods. And each city has a god. And they have these structures where they actually share with each other. And in these structures they have grains. So they're saving grains, but they share with each other. So each city belongs to a god, and there's gods everywhere in nature. Disease, body, fire, river, there's so many gods. And so you build these temples, and now this is going to be really important because for the Sumerians, not only do they develop writing and architecture, but there's a priest. Now that's important because a priest, and this is what I call a God-man relationship. Now that sets up dynamics, students, that continues to impact us today when we think about priests or reverends or whoever that is, is connected or very religious. So that they develop that God-man relationship, and so priests have a lot of power. Now, the literature, there is literature, and it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I would like for you to go online and understand who the characters are and do an overview of that, understand what the story's about. And so, in short, the Sumerians didn't believe in an afterlife. They believed that when you died, you became a shade, just this shade, of nothing, a shade of nothingness. And so life was very important every day. Egyptians, not so much. They had a very elaborate death ritual and this idea of traveling to the afterlife and let me build a pyramid so I can put all my stuff and take it with me. Very elaborate. Not the Sumerians. So if you don't believe in afterlife, what is your literature going to look like? What will it reflect? It's not going to reflect afterlife. So it's a story about very briefly a king Gilgamesh who wasn't a handsome guy, who wasn't happy with his city, and he goes on this quest and he faces all these monsters to find a way that he can live forever because he wants to become immortal because no one wants to die. So eventually in this literature, and we have the tablets, not all of them. We have parts of this. Now, there's no paper, so this literature or this book is actually carved into stone. And so Gilgamesh goes off. He does find, he's given a plant. He eventually is given this plant of immortality, and he's on his way back home. But there are many obstacles. He had to pass water, a lot of water stories and creation theories. There's a lot of water stories. In all creation stories, there's water. So he's coming back home, he's crossing the water, and a snake takes the leaf, that vegetation from him. That is his immortality. Now, you've heard of snakes before in other stories, and a snake is very symbolic because it sheds its skin and it's sort of seen symbolically as rebirth, so this is not unusual. Well, he goes back to Sumer, and he has a different attitude. He sees, now that he doesn't have immortality, he comes back and he sees his city is beautiful and it's golden as the light hits it from the setting sun, and he appreciates his life. And that's, the story doesn't end that he has immortality, but it does have, which starts as pessimism, it does end with, well, I need to appreciate what I have. So you need to review that online, that story. So here is a piece of Um, this is a tablet, and I'm going to go back. You see, the Sumerians are important because not only did you develop architecture and a god-man relationship, but they also developed writing. And these are examples of writing. And so their writing is called cuneiform. The writing for the Egyptians is called hieroglyphics. So this is cuneiform. So I've also have a little image here that I've imported so you can write your name in cuneiform using our alphabet. So those are for me, again, I think of a big picture. This is the big picture for me. But there are many, many other things they did, and I also can show you here, on this lower table, other things that they did. They also, during this period, did the calendar year, 360 days. They put time into 60 minutes. So, they did a lot. Well, this is a bazookarat, and here is a schematic drawing on your top left. And then here is that ziggurat in the desert from a bird's eye view from a plane. And it's in Iraq. And the reason I put this picture of U.S. soldiers climbing that ziggurat is not for any political reason. It is to show you, to connect to you, that this ancient, ancient, ancient piece of architecture still exists. And that's amazing. Much of it has been damaged from, time and weather, but it still exists. And as I said, it's only made out of sun-dried brick. It's not concrete. It's not steel. So that's why I want to show you that picture. And when you look at the top one, it does look sort of pyramidal, doesn't it? It is sloped walled, sloped planes. There is repetition of plane and pattern. And it also looks like Aztec. So actually the early Egyptians, their earliest pyramidal forms were like this, like King Zoser. It is, the pyramid of King Zoser is very much like a step pyramid. But of course later the pyramids in the Egyptians become a much more smooth-walled. So that is a ziggurat. And in that picture, you can see the schematic drawing, what we think it looked like. That's where you would have the storage of grains. That's where you would have a priest. That's where you would have some of those statues. And I'd like to go back to their government. They were actually a city-state government. And that's an important point that I didn't put on the slide. Another thing that I didn't put on the slide is that their city-state government, the Sumerians, when they had a problem, they would create, I'm going to call like a committee, and they would have like a committee chair. They would create an assembly, and then they would have a leader of that assembly to resolve these problems. They didn't have a president that was elected. And when that problem was resolved, then that assembly dissipated. City-state means, just like we have city-state, and we have state and federal, is that those cities, those different cities, like for one, or Sumer, well, they worked with each other. They shared things. They governed. Although they had one god that was of that city, that's what we mean by city-state. Okay? So again, I go back and I say, okay, well, let's look at some of these words. Planular, slope walls, repetition of shapes. Scale is important. It's very big. And then I've already covered about what that facility or architecture would be doing with the storage and the priests, etc. Okay. So this is an example, well, this is really being photographed, the tablets of the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written 2000 BC, and we still have these parts. They had wisdom literature. All of this is in your text, and I'm not so much on this video, but on the PowerPoint, I've given you pages. And so I've already talked about the theme, the major theme of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Students, every civilization is going to have epics, just like we have epics, epic stories. So you're going to see with the Greeks, you have epic stories, and with the Romans, you're going to have epic stories. So, and then with India, you have epic story. So we have these epic stories that reflects what that culture believes. So as I've already said, this region, they just conquer each other. They just conquer each other. And we're going to look at each one of those conquerors or civilizations. Again, they're very similar. They live in the region, but then they just say, okay, we're going to take what this guy has. And they conquer each other. Now, I showed you a slide and we said, okay, the order is Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonians, Assyrians, and the Persians. So here's an example of, now this is very different because this is Akkadian. The Akkadians conquer the Sumerians. They assimilate. So what is unique about the Akkadians? They think this is Sargon the first, which is the first ruler. That's what's important because, as I said, the Sumerians were city-state. They didn't have a ruler. They worked with each other, each city, in sharing goods or either defending each other. But now with the Akkadians, you have the first ruler. So again, here you have pattern, repetition of shape with the beard. You have large eyes, one brow, patterned on the headpiece. So, but this is so much more realistic, and it is cast bronze. It's in metal. Why would it be realistic? Because a ruler would like for you to know what they look like. That's why. That's why Napoleon had statues everywhere. That's why in certain countries like Iraq, you had statues everywhere of that ruler. They're everywhere because that ruler wants to make sure you know who he is. And so here I've highlighted, again, some of the art vocabulary that you could be using. Now, the Akkadians are going to be conquered by the Babylonians, and it's going to go back less realistic and more stylized and abstraction. In all cultures, you build to what we call high culture. High culture is the epitome of what that culture accomplishes, and the Babylonians is the high culture of this region. Because, like the gardens of Babylon, and of course Alexander the Great, the Roman, will conquer the Babylonians. As well as the Assyrians, because what's going to happen is you have Neo-Babylonians and you have Neo-Sumerians that I'm not going to talk about. So where the Babylonians are first conquered by the Assyrians, then they come back, the Neo-Babylonians, and then they're conquered by the Roman Alexander. So this is why the Babylonians are so important, is because of their king Hammurabi. This is the coat of Hammurabi, and it is only the top part, because this is actually 7 feet tall. It is a piece of stone. It's called a stele, and it is 282 law codes. It's the first unified law code. And that's the Babylonians. And this is what it looks like. And so here you have close-up of the cuneiform of this law code, as well as you can see the top part. And this law code is very, very important because, now we're in like 1750 BC, because someone created law codes a body of laws that are written down. And it's very interesting if you go and look at this. I suggest you do. You can just pull it up because it was actually very violent and it was class driven. But as you can see right here, adultery for a woman, death. Stealing, death. Receiving stolen goods, death. Bearing false witness, death. If you had something and you didn't have like a receipt or someone to say, yes, he purchased that, it was assumed it was stolen. So you had to have, I don't want to say receipts, but evidence. Or you could lose your life. So, it was very strict, but there were good things. Like, although women were very subservient to men, and men had multiple wives, women didn't have multiple husbands, they were still in some ways protected by the law, and children in this law code. And also, it actually established the first alimony. So if you're married to a man and you have children and he leaves and then he can't leave you penniless. He has to still provide for you, even though he has multiple wives. So that's very important. The Babylonians are high culture, and they developed Hammurabi, the King Hammurabi, the first unified law code, and that still exists. The Babylonians are conquered by the Syrians. Well, what makes the Syrians different? The Syrians are just ferocious warriors. Conquering. Their favorite sports were warring and lion hunting. And so this image on the wall is just a section of one of the citadels. Students, this is the first time they started building citadels, which is places for soldiers to house and train. So now you have citadels. And those are the Syrians. The Syrians are conquered by the Persians. And something very interesting about the Persians that I think you would find fascinating. The Persians conquer the Assyrians, but the Persian river is called Zoroastrianism. Persians unified the nations of the Near East, and Zoroastrianism existed. That's very interesting because Zoroastrianism is monotheism. It emphasizes ethics and believes in one God as a source of truth and justice. And, as you may or may not know, all Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all emerge from the Near East. So that's another monotheistic faith, early faith, as well as Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh. And that's it. The rest are polytheistic. So now we're in with Egypt. Egypt, if I call the cradle of civilization Mesopotamia, then I call Egypt Arts of the Afterlife, because everything is about the afterlife. They are just obsessed with the afterlife. And so, of course, here is a sculpture of Akhenaten's wife, Queen Nefertiti. And Egyptian history is broken into several kingdoms: the old, the middle, and the new. Akhenaten is in part of the new kingdom. He was the sun pharaoh who believed in replaced polytheism by monotheism. Obviously, that was not going to be popular. And then when he died, everything that he represented was destroyed. And so this is just an overview of that early period when they do centralize and develop their ideas about, traditions and authority. uh, that lasted for 3,000 years. So here you have the pyramids. The pyramids. Um, the pyramids are very important because they also are an example of how the afterlife was so important. Now, these are actually tombs. You know, they're tombs for pharaohs, or there's small, pyramids for their children or whatever. But these are tombs, and these tombs have mummies in them. The pharaoh would be mummified, and they took people with them for this journey, and they have objects and boats and personal things. And so, Pharaoh are part God. So they're not human, they're also part God. So the Pharaoh rules because he's part man and part God, because he has this kinship with Mot, who is she is the goddess of truth and justice. And you did not oppose the Pharaoh. You did not. The only female queen that ruled was Queen Hatshepsut. And this is her mortuary temple. Now, a mortuary temple is actually not like a pyramid. They stopped building pyramids for several reasons. Number one, it was very expensive, and during particular periods they came into some economic hardship as well. People were going in and finding these all these objects, and they were just stealing. They were just going into these pyramids and stealing the stuff. Although they did build these false chambers, people would still go in there and loot. So because of those two reasons, they started to build rock-cut tombs. And this is what this is, a rock-cut tomb. But it's a very large one because it has a mortuary temple in the front, and that's what you're seeing. Sometimes that rock-cut tomb was just on the side of a mountain with an, where they had entered that mountain, and then it was closed off. But this is Queen Hatshepsut, the only shortly female queen that ruled, and this is her mortuary temple in front of her rock-cut tomb. I've already talked about this. This is the sculpture of Queen Nefertiti, and their sculptures are very interesting because they're carved in stone or they're made in plaster, and if they're made in plaster, many of them are painted like this. Painted. So this is a mummy. This is a mummy of the son of Ramses the Great in the New Kingdom. Now, before I talk about mummification and afterlife, you see, these pyramids and like the Ramses sculptures were huge. They were huge. They were monumental in scale. And that scale reflect the dominance and the permanence of a civilization that lasted so long. These weren't just little architectures. These were huge monuments, monumental. And so then because also they're preoccupied with afterlife, and you have, by the way, there's hundreds and hundreds of mummies because there's so much mummification taking place. Now, like I said, they have over 2,000 gods. My colleague knows a lot of them. I don't really care to know. That's a lot. But this idea of the afterlife and preserving this body was important. And so you have these mummies. And mummification is very simply the idea of taking out fleshy parts like the brain. They didn't know the brain was important, so you just pulverize inside the ear with sticks and make that a hollow cavity. You take out organs, you put them in canopic jars. It's because you want the body to be an empty cavity. You don't want it to be filled with a lot of fluid and organs. And so once that body, that cavity, chest cavity is empty, then you can wrap the body through desiccation, which is drying the body. And we just dry everything out, the flesh and the bones. And then you have a mummy, and then that mummy is actually put into a beautifully painted sarcophagus, which is like a tomb. So, originally pharaohs were the only ones that were mummified and could become immortal. And then later you have nobility could. And so this idea of immortality meant too that in these tombs you had spirits that lived there, like the Ka. And these spirits could move of this pharaoh, could move in and out of this tomb. So this is your immortality. Now, they have legends, they have myths. And like I said early on, a myth is very important because we would say, oh, well, that's just a myth. But myths are ways humankind comes to terms with nature, things that occur in our lives that we can't control, that are greater than ourselves. And so this impulse to create, we want to tell stories and we want to create this literature that really talks about or defines who we are. And so the legend of these two gods, Osiris and Isis, is actually very important because it's very similar to the Cain and Abel story when you review this. And I would like for you to look at this legend and be familiar with it and what happens, because it's about a brother's jealousy against another brother and how he's brought back to life by his wife, Isis going and gathering the parts to bring him back to life. So his wife and sister, don't let that confuse you, wife and sister. Isis is the mother goddess that goes and gets the parts and brings him back to life because his brother Set, his rival, had killed him and chopped him up and put him all over the world in different places. So I think what's important about this as well is you can see how even our biblical stories are very similar to these earlier stories. Just like there's always water, there's always floods, there's always passing over water. And so what you have is these archetypal stories that occur in all civilizations that are about our nature, our human nature, like jealousy. And so there you see it in Egyptian history, and then you see it in biblical history. So, enough said about that. In Egyptian literature, you have wonderful love poems that are in your book if you want to read them. Funerary text. The Book of the Dead is actually funerary text, and you would actually pay someone to write this for you. And this is the hymns that guide you when you have passed and your soul is weighed against, and that's that picture at the top there. Your soul, your heart, representing your soul, is weighed against the weight of a feather. And then there's these certain hymns or incantations that you're supposed to know to say, and so you've got the Book of the Dead, and that tells you what to say. So those are pages from the Book of the Dead, and this is on, obviously they didn't have paper like we have it, so stories are being carved on clay tablets or in stone. In this case it's papyrus, and it is in hieroglyphics. Now, this is going to be very important later. this sculpture is going to be very, very, very important later, because the Greeks are going to copy the Egyptians. The early Greek sculptures are going to look just like this, except the subject will be different. And so this sculpture of King Mycerinus, well, Pharaoh Mycerinus, and his queen are representative of what sculpture would look like. It's very large, life-size. It's in stone, so that's pretty permanent, semi-permanent anyway, versus wood. And many, many, many of the wooden sculptures in early Africa are lost because wood deteriorates and rots. And so what you see here is that the queen is standing by her man, and this is typical of what a sculpture would look like. Formal stance, left foot forward, always left foot. The pharaoh would be bare-chested, he's wearing a skirt, like the Sumerians, like the Abu Temple, but much more realistic. So again, here you're doing these comparisons. And so we just appropriate. These styles or these appropriations, it's not really new. We just change them, the change stylistically. It's either going to be a representational or abstract. And he's got a distant gaze because, after all, he is part God, so he shouldn't be looking straight at you like a person. He's got a cut chest. She's standing there in a garment, the queen, that hugs her body. I call it sort of like a wet t-shirt dress. And this is what Egyptian sculpture would predominantly look like if it were Pharaoh and his queen, or it would look like if it was a god. And oftentimes the Pharaoh, a goddess, would be standing next to him. In this case, it's his queen. And this is carved on slate. And so those descriptions I've notated in this slide, as well as its representational and a formal stance. But you should know some of these details, like left foot forward. It's actually called latent movement. I didn't say that in the slide. Latent means it's not quite there. You're not quite moving. You're just left foot forward and you stopped. And then there's other characteristics, as well as clenched fists, and the knees are pretty exaggerated. There is music. Now, there also, with the Sumerians, there are harps. I didn't show you a picture of that. A lot of things, of course, have been lost earlier to that, but we do have these objects in museums. And these are, so you have harps, and you have these trumpets, and you have these flutes. Yeah, layers. And that's the end. And this is sort of an overview of this region of Mesopotamia, and then looking at Egypt. And, you know, these Near Eastern civilizations invented a lot of important things, just as Africa did. And I've listed them here, and we've talked about many of them already, so I don't need to read this. But I want to talk about some things, is why they remain that way, whereas when we go to the Greeks, and there's a lot about the Greeks because that's European, is why the Greeks progressed the way they did. And although the ancient Near East and Egypt were very inventive and very important, there was a period, they stopped this myth, they sort of stopped with myth making. They were rationale, they built the pyramids. But the Greeks moved towards this idea about what it means to be human, where this region did not. And they continued to believe in myths and talk about, you know, what they inherited from their ancestors. Well, the Greeks believed in myths and gods, But the Greeks did something a little different in that they developed a scientific mind of inquiry and a self-consciousness that this region did not. And the Greeks developed all these philosophies. And then by the time you get to the Romans, then they're civil engineers. And so you have a shift in the West. Whereas although the East is very important for all these things that occurred that influenced the West, influenced, what we think and live, the Greeks are going to do it a little differently because of that reason. They were focused on what it means to be human, and this region, the ancient Near East and Egypt, did not. They did not focus on the individual like that. It was always about the collective and who was in charge and following those rules.